Well, good morning, church. Happy Sabbath. Another hot day. We're not used to this, are we? I don't remember a heat wave that lasted this long, ever. I don't know if any of you have. This is unique, that is for sure. Well, Peter wasn't able to be here today. He was going to be speaking. He called me Wednesday and said, I don't know. He says, I got called up to Fort Mac. Somebody, I think, cut some cable, fiber optic cable, or something happened there anyway. So his crew had to go up there and fix the mess. So he says, I don't know if I'll be able to be back in time, but he wasn't able to. Text me yesterday and says, can't make it. Sorry. Said, no problem. We'll launch forward anyway. So, yeah. Last week I was up at Marathorpe, and after our fellowship lunch, I got in the car and I'm backing up, and it's like something just doesn't feel right. And I thought, well, I'll pull up on the pavement, just see what's going on and see if I feel it still. I did. So I only went about a block. I didn't even get out of town. Good thing. Pull over in some side road and looking at a flat tire. So here I'm in my suit, hot, fairly warm, and have to fix a flat. But providentially, God is good. There was a young guy coming across the field right then, saw the situation, saw me in a suit and a flat tire. You could see the tire was flat. It was on his side. And said, hey, would you like some help changing the flat? So it was a good thing, because otherwise I would have been in the dust trying to do it, because the wheel wouldn't come off. Like it would not. It was seized right on there. And thankfully, the neighbor, I was in this back alley, saw or heard or whatever, and came over and says, would you like a hammer? And I said, yeah. So he brought as big a hammer as he had. And this younger guy was able to get underneath the car and beat the rim off. But otherwise, there's no way. Like, if that would have happened on the road, so now we're going to have to carry a pretty big hammer in the car just to be able to change in case something ever happens, right? Because there's no way I would have got that off. He kicked on it, and I didn't want to do it with my shoes because I'd probably end up wrecking them. But he beat on it. He couldn't get the thing off at all. So, that was rather interesting. But I got the spare on. Of course, that was half flat, so had to go put air in that. Anyway, enough of stories about that. That was last weekend, so. But everything's good this weekend, except for the heat. I titled this Lessons from the Past, and this is rather vague, but this is Lessons from the Past / I guess, Sunday Laws is what this will be. An interesting story I'd like to read is, anyone remember Vance Farrell? Does that ring a bell? Natural Remedies Encyclopedia? Anyway, his son wrote this article, and I'm going to read it, a little bit of he does like an introduction and then the story of this man, which is rather interesting story. So I want to do that, and then we could have a little bit of a discussion, possibly on this. Some lessons that we can learn from this, I think, would be good as we look forward. But it begins thus. Back in 1987, Sunday laws were enforced in Fiji. I did not know that. Sunday laws were enforced in Fiji. It says, you may be wondering, how did it transpire? Let me explain. So this is Seth Farrell that's writing. It says the population of the Fiji Islands was 50% Fijian, which is indigenous Fijians and a mixture of Melanesians and Polynesians, and 30% Indian, this is from India, and 6% other. Says over the years, says there has been a persistent political struggle between the Fijians and the Indians. This is in Fiji. Interesting history, I did not know any of this. There were 4 coups, says, to grasp the government, says, by these 2 opposing nationalities. At the center of each coup was the tension between the ethnic Fijians and the Indian Fijians. It says religion played a significant role because of the majority of ethnic Fijians belonged to the Methodist Church. Interesting. It says while the majority of the Indian Fijians were, guess what? Hindu. Hindu, right? Says when the Christian ethnic Fijians, says, had power, says they made Sunday laws in order to harass the Indians. Now you imagine getting caught in the crossfire of that one. It says these laws impacted the Seventh-day Adventists more severely, though they were bystanders. It says during the enforcement of these Sunday laws in Fiji, my father Vance says sent one of his employees to Fiji with the purpose of writing an article about the situation. It says that was almost 37 years ago. Though I was a child, I still remember that event. It says many years later, it says when I lived in California, I developed a very close friendship with a godly Fijian man. His name was Asak, which means Isaac. It says, but he goes by Sake, actually. He experienced imprisonment for Sabbath keeping during the Sunday laws. I have interviewed him, and the following is his story. Sake was working as a general manager at a very large resort in Fiji. He was 32 years old at the time and had a wife and 2 children, a 2-month-old and a 1-year-old. Sake gave me this summary. The Sunday law came from the president of the Methodist Church. Interesting. Says who was working together with the Catholic Church. Take note of all this, and then we can discuss later. It says Parliament agreed that you could only go to church on Sunday, not on any other day. On Sunday, all the stores had to be closed. It says, and there was no public transportation on that day. If anyone went to church on the Sabbath, they would be taken to jail. That was back in the days of no internet, just TV and radio. Each police station issued the news that came from the Parliament. The military and the police were united in order to make sure no one was going to church on Sabbath or working on Sunday. On Sundays, the military and police would head off into the villages and look for lawbreakers working in their gardens. Here is Sake's full story. We read in the newspaper, this is Sake now speaking, says we read in the newspapers of many Adventists who had been jailed for their faith. I was an elder in the local SDA church, and on the second Sabbath morning after the Sunday law was passed, the police came to our church. Sounds interesting. It's familiar, huh? Says it was a beautiful morning, and surprisingly all the members were at church. That is neat, right? All the members were there. It says, even with the threat of possible imprisonment hanging over their heads. It says, I was leading our opening song, O Worship the Lord, which is what we sang. O Worship the Lord. It says, when we heard the sirens in the distance speeding toward us, they stopped right outside our church, and the soldiers and police suddenly burst through the door. Some members stopped singing, but many fearlessly continued to pour forth praises to God. I continued singing as they steadily walked toward me. Without saying a word, they proceeded to handcuff some of us. I had a small Bible in my bag. I had a small Bible in my bag, which I quickly grabbed and stuffed into my pocket. I was peaceful as a lamb, unlike some of my other brothers in the church who argued and even fought with the police. Some of our members were champion boxers and wanted to show that they would not be easily taken. Says, sometimes we like to fight for the Lord, he says. Says, but we need to realize that this battle belongs to the Lord, and he will fight for us. I was arrested because of my faith, but I had done nothing wrong. Our pastor, the elders, and I were led out of the church. As they put us into the police vehicle, we could hear the other members still singing. Later, I learned that many members stayed there all day and prayed for us and the other Adventists in Fiji. I had never gone to jail before. As the police van entered the jail, I was a bit anxious about what was before me. When we arrived at our cell, it was too small. Many Adventists were already in the cell, so they released some to make room for us. There was only a metal bench in our cell, no beds or blankets, just a concrete floor. The goal of the police was to lock up the prominent members. They knew that I managed the big resort. And with me, there were school teachers, nurses, doctors, and lawyers, all locked up in jail. I could see all my brothers, says, who were in that cell with me, and none of us seemed afraid. We knew that we stood for the truth. We began to sing and to praise God. After a while, the police began bringing us food. Most of the time, we prayed while we were imprisoned. All fear had left us then, and death seemed like nothing because we rejoiced so much. That night was cold, and it was not an easy thing to lie down in the concrete. It will surprise you, but I recall the concrete being as comfortable as a mattress. Isn't that something? It says we slept soundly, as if we were on plush mattresses. It says all the angels in heaven were watching and protecting God's children. The police or military did not mistreat or physically harm us, and I do not know of any other members who were mistreated. It says other than being imprisoned. I was not raised a Seventh-day Adventist, he says. I was raised a Methodist. I had already studied about the Sunday law, and I was filled with courage as I faced it. We have to eat the Word and fill ourselves with the Word. The more you eat the Word, the stronger you grow. The Holy Spirit will give you the courage to endure and the proper words to say. On that day, the promises of God flooded into my mind. There were 2 verses that I began sharing with my brothers. It is the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. So they are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The faithfulness of God is so powerful because if you stand on the holy ground of God, you will never be afraid. I know because I have been there. I was not afraid of being killed. If God be for us, who can be against us? These texts and many more came forcibly to mind. I had forgotten them, but on that day I remembered them. I am telling you this because we should not be afraid to hear the tidings of the approaching crisis. We've been preparing ourselves for so long, so let it be. Early in the morning, when we woke up, one of the police officers came over to us and tried to get us to deny our faith. He said, "You can't sleep like this. You have families." In a loving way, we told him, "We have known this God for so long. How can we deny our God in front of you?" My close friend was a very intelligent school teacher and studied the Bible very much. He told the officer, "I would like to talk with you. May I introduce myself to you?" Then he began to pour out the word. This police officer had a gun in his hand. With the gun in his hand, listened. And a moment later, he put his gun away and kept listening as the youthful teacher unfolded Bible truths to him. He said, "Think about where the Sunday came from." After some time, the officer left, but within 10 minutes, he came back with 5 friends. He then explained, "We would like to hear again what you said. It says, we were all sitting on the concrete floor as the godly teacher instructed again. After some time, the interested officers left. At about 12 noon, we heard voices again. After entering the cell, the chief police exclaimed, "We don't understand what wrongdoing you have done." It says, "We have seen you not complaining, but rather praising God and praying." It says, "You have to go home now." It says, "We see nothing wrong with you guys, but we learned a lot this morning about Sunday," which is kind of neat. "My wife and children were so excited when I arrived back home. It was a joyful reunion, and we quickly dropped to our knees to thank our kind and faithful Father for his deliverance. Truly, we experienced the fulfillment of the promises of Jesus." Isn't that a good story? Powerful. I did not know that they had Sunday laws, and this is unique Sunday laws because they were not allowed to go to church on Sabbath, right? Which differs from what happened in early Adventism, right? Turn of the century. The issue was with Sunday, not working on Sunday, but they could still worship on Sabbath, right? So it was different. Very much different, actually. This is unique. I don't know how many times this exactly has happened in different countries around the world, but where they couldn't worship at all on Sabbath. That's unique. But I found it interesting, and I think we can learn various lessons probably from this one, right? One lesson is, I find interesting, that it was the Methodists who actually pushed this, right? We know it's going to be a religious group, Catholic or other, that's going to push it, right? It's not going to be some secular group. It wasn't going to be the Hindus that were doing this, right? The issue was religious zealots, I guess, is really what it was in their time. And it was interesting, which was rather interesting. It was just to get back or whatever at the Indians, so they had this clash, right? You know, between the Hindus and that, they were gonna, if they were given power, they're gonna make it rough for the other sect, right? But don't we see this political climate, you know, especially in the U.S., where there's this division, and you know, one side will like to get back at the other side, and so forth like this. I mean, there's this climate exists today. So I was one thing that I thought of for sure, and the other one was the aspect of how this man approached the crisis versus others in his church, right? With the boxers, right? They weren't going to go easily. Can we learn a lesson from that? I think we can. You know, we need to be oftentimes more like lambs than like wolves, right? Christ said, "Hey, I send you as sheep among wolves," right? But if we act like wolves instead of sheep, what good is it? Now, do we glorify God by that? I guess that's the question, right? That we need to ask ourselves. You know, as I was thinking of this, I thought of Pastor Coates in Edmonton during the COVID situation, and you know what? I admired his demeanor, really. I take this as a quote from him during that time period. He says, "I'm simply here in obedience to Jesus Christ," he said, "and it's my obedience to Christ that has put me at odds with the law." Now, I was thinking this, we could transport this into the future, right? With Sunday laws, the same way. And the same way he approached it, I like that. It's a good approach. The court is aware that I'm contesting the legitimacy of that law, but please make no mistake, I'm not trying to make a point. And I think this is very good, really, because Pastor Coates understood something. We're going to look at that, what he understood, which is very important. So he says, "I'm not a political revolutionary." That's exactly true. I mean, that's the way we need to be. We don't go into a crisis with boxing gloves on. Right? He didn't do that. He just stood. Simple as that, right? And like he said, hey, I'm standing in obedience to Christ. That's what it is. And I think that's what we need to do. Now, we know this here was written in 1911, but there's another whole article she wrote dealing with the Sunday laws and how to respond to them in 1902. I won't read that. It was a long one. It's one you probably know or have heard about anywhere, where she talks about instead of being defiant and working on Sunday, because that was the issue, right? She says there's missionary things. There's things you can do, right? There are things you can do that is still work, but maybe not menial work out in your garden or whatever you might be doing that will agitate the neighbors. And Ellen White's whole point with that she was dealing with is the aspect of agitation. We don't need to agitate on those points. We don't need to be needling. We don't need to go into this crisis with boxing gloves on, right? Is really what she was the whole point she was trying to present there. I'm going to read a little bit what she wrote in 1911. And this is regarding the workers that were working with those in the South. Okay? Listen, because there's some good comments here. And you'll see the principle that she says, and I think it's good that we discuss and talk about this, because one thing during COVID is that we saw within the churches, not just Adventist Church, is disagreements and contention over even how to deal with the crisis or how to handle the crisis or what are we to do in this crisis, right? But look at a principle here that we see, and this is going back to the principle I see with, are we going as a lamb or are we going to go into this fighting with boxing gloves, right? From the light that I have received, she begins, I see that if we would get the truth before the Southern people, says we must not encourage the colored people to work on Sunday. Says there must be a clear understanding regarding this. Says we are not to make efforts to teach the Southern people to work on Sunday. This is rather interesting. Says that which some of our brethren have written upon the point is not based upon right principles. When the principles of the people do not come in conflict with the law of God, says you may conform to them. So there's a principle, right? Now remember, they were not dealing with Sabbath. They were only dealing with Sunday back then, and Sunday laws and blue laws, right? They were put on. This, I think, was more dealing with blue laws. I don't know if 1911 there was actually Sunday laws that were being pushed, other than blue laws, which are Sunday laws, I guess, and there were maybe more in local areas. But basically, as she was talking to the leaders and saying is, when they have new converts that come in, don't push them into being like rebels, right? And deliberately agitating. Don't push this, right? It says if the workers fail to do this, it says they will not only hinder their own work, but they will place stumbling blocks in the way of those for whom they labor and hinder them from accepting the truth. On Sunday, there is the very best opportunity for those who are missionaries to hold Sunday schools. And some of the people in the simplest manner possible. It says telling them of the love of Jesus for sinners and educating them in the scriptures. Use it for evangelism is really what it was, right? So the question is, I was asked, says, should not those in the southern field work on Sunday? She goes on, says, if they do this, there is danger that as soon as the opposing elements can get the slightest opportunity, they will stir up one another to persecute those whom they hate. Says, at present, Sunday keeping is not a test, which is true, right? Says the time will come when men will not only forbid Sunday work, but they will try to force men to labor on the Sabbath. That's the key, right? In other words, you're not even able to just keep the Sabbath, but they're going to force you to work on the Sabbath. That's a whole other story, right? That's a whole other story. And to subscribe to Sunday observance or forfeit your freedom and their lives. Their freedom and their lives. But the time for this has not yet come. For the truth must be presented more fully before the people as a witness. It says, what I have said about this should not be understood as referring to the action of old Sabbath keepers who understand the truth. It says they must move as the Lord shall direct them, but let them consider that they can do the best missionary work on Sunday. So that was the counsel she gave then under that particular situation. And I think it was wise, and you can see the wisdom in this, right? Don't deliberately agitate. This is Sunday. Sabbath, you can still worship. That's what she said. You can still worship on Sabbath. They're not touching that. They're just saying you cannot work on Sunday. It's like, well, there's other work we can do. We don't have to be out in the garden, or we don't have to be mowing, or we don't have to be doing whatever on that particular day. That's wisdom, right? That's wisdom. But I know there's some that even during this COVID time, we're applying this principle to everything. And even the Sabbath. And I was like, you can't do that. You know? And some would maybe say, oh, even what they did when they were told not to worship, them assembling was not good. The Sabbath is a different scenario, and they didn't even have to face that back in Ellen White's day. Her council was dealing with Sunday. I don't hear any council ever talking about what to do on Sabbath. But I think there's a Bible principle in regard to the Sabbath, and you can see how they handled the situation was with wisdom and tact. And they prayed, and they sang. And they were able to give a Bible study in prison, and what a result, right? I think that's the key that I see, is wisdom being involved there. Any thoughts that, as we read that you had that kind of popped to mind?
I think I remember reading, just kind of on the subject of working the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And I think Greece has switched to a 6-day work week.
You're right.
So I don't know, I would imagine
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Have you heard any updates on that? I heard that too.
yeah,
Like as far as the church and how they're handling that situation. No. That would be interesting to get some updates and just see how that's going. That's true. That is something else. I like this quote. Never is the tempest-tried soul more dearly loved by his Savior than when he is suffering reproach for the truth's sake. That's a good one to remember. It says, when for the truth's sake the believer stands at the bar of earthly tribunals, Christ stands by his side. We have to remember that, right? It says, when he is confined within prison walls, it says, Christ manifests himself to him and cheers his heart with his love. We see that's what happened in that cell. It says, when he suffers death for Christ's sake, the Savior says to him, they may kill the body, but they cannot hurt the soul. That's good. We're looking at something I know most Adventists fear, because we've heard it, right? We've heard of the time of trouble, such as never was. And many are fearful and don't even want to go there. But really, as we read this story here and saw what God did for them, it should be an encouragement, right, for us. Yes. Right. Yeah. Right. I don't know. I honestly don't know that. That's I should have looked that up. You think it's Friday? Muslims is Friday, but not Hindus. I don't know, honestly, if Hindus have a particular day or what. That's a good question. Guess I should have looked that up.
No set day or time.
Which? No set time?
No set day or time. There's no.
So they were probably forcing them into that particular day anyway. They couldn't worship on any other day. They were going to be all on that, which, whatever, if they have no set one, it'd be relatively easy, I guess. But boy, Adventists got caught in the crossfire there. That's for sure.
Particular deities, days of the week are associated with particular deities. Shiva is honored on Monday and Hanuman on Tuesday.
So it's which deity, I guess different deities you worship on different days, are associated that. So I guess it would mess that up if you're, that's interesting. Church and, very much church and state combining. Right.
It's very clever. I mean, it's basically about secularism versus, religion.
Right. Right. Very true.
You can't agree with, I mean, all the nonsense that's going on with the left is secularism to the extreme.
Sure.
Anything against God.
Yep.
That's their home. You know, so, but never have you seen a convention, if you watch any of them, where speaker after speaker after speaker endorse God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, you talked about the right and the left, and it's rather interesting because in Great Controversy 587, she says, this very class put forth the claim that the fast-spreading corruption, do we see that today? And isn't there a concern on the right, especially in the U.S., about this fast-spreading corruption is largely attributable, they say, to the desecration of the so-called Sunday Sabbath. They would just say it's becoming irreligious, right? That particular day, their sacred day. And that the enforcement of Sunday observance would greatly improve the morals of society. So you can see where this would come in, right? It's like, it's a bizarre thinking, though, that you can force people into a day, worshiping on a day, and you think you're going to improve morality that way? It's a bizarre thinking that you can improve morality by force. It just doesn't happen, right? Yeah. Sure. Mm.
Most people would think what day you go to church, even if you're non-Christian,
Yeah.
well, they go to church on Sunday.
Sure.
That's a gift.
Tradition.
So that's, you look at it and you can't go to that.
Right. No, exactly. But the devil will work on the pendulum swing, right? You know, it swings hard left, and then, boy, does it swing hard right. And that's the problem. And you have basically the same kind of contentions what they had back in Fiji, right? You had this clashing of the two. And when one got into power, they're going to deal with the other, and they'll enact laws to deal with them, right? And you can see how that's just going to happen, right? And how Sunday laws could easily come in is this whole thing as far as the pendulum swing. Here's a good quotation. Oh, is this the one? It says, though enemies may thrust them into prison, yet dungeon walls cannot cut off the communication between their souls and Christ. It says, one who sees their every weakness, who is acquainted with every trial, is above all earthly powers, and angels will come to them in lowly cells, bringing light and peace from heaven. The prison will be as a palace. Interesting, because they talked about this concrete that was like mattresses, right? I found that fascinating. And then she says here, the prison will be as a palace. That's pretty cool. It says, for the rich in faith dwell there, and the gloomy walls will be lifted up with heavenly light, as when Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises at midnight in the Philippian dungeon. We can see this, right? I think this is an encouraging article or testimony or whatever, simply because we know it's a reality, and it's already happened dealing with Sabbath, which I found fascinating. The other was just Sunday, which was a totally different scenario, really. But this is actually dealing with not able to worship on Sabbath, which is huge, right? Which I see as huge with that. You know, there's another aspect too, and I guess this would be the negative aspect is, and it didn't really happen there other than the boxing glove thing, but contention on how to know how to deal with a crisis, right? And I think COVID kind of showed us that in the churches and going beyond just the Adventist church, but churches in general, as far as contention amongst members of how to deal with a crisis. And that's why I think it's good before the crisis to be able to study the council as much as possible, right? This, I didn't have time to study like I wanted to study for this, because I wasn't even preparing this. But last minute, I thought, this is a good story, I want you to hear it, and then we could talk about it a little bit. But I didn't have a lot of time to be able to flesh it out as far as thoughts. But I just thought that is something that we do need to, as a people, be able to come together and to be able to understand what do we do in a crisis? How do we handle a crisis? What is God's counsel in the crisis? And I think that's what we need to study instead of our own thoughts, right? What does God say in this? Now, we have counsel in regard to the Sunday laws, and it will be progressive. By the sounds of it, it may be this way. It'll come in this way, where there's just a Sunday law in regard to Sunday, but we can still worship on Sabbath. But when the Sabbath laws come, if you want to look at it that way, where we cannot worship on Sabbath, or we cannot worship, plus we got to work on Sabbath, that's a totally different scenario. What do we do then? How do we respond? Are we going to be united, or is there going to be a division amongst us, right? And I like how they did it, because there's those that stayed while the others were taken off to prison, and they were praying and they were singing, which is cool. Which I think is we can learn a lot from the Fijians as they went through this crisis, right? And good results happened this way. There was not fighting. You never hear in anywhere this story where they were fighting about how we should deal with the crisis. Should we be doing this, or should we not be doing this? Should the church be closed? This was not ever an issue with them. They knew the church should be open, right? I know there's some even pastors saying, well, nowhere in the Bible does it say we have to be in a church on Sabbath. Is that so? Do we know from the Bible if that's so? Supposed to gather, but does the Bible say anything about gathering on the Sabbath? It says, thou shalt not work on the Sabbath. Do we know anywhere in the Bible where it says we must gather on the Sabbath? He went in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Right, and why did Christ do that? Was he just doing his own thing? Was he just following tradition? Or was there a reason for that? Leviticus 23:3. Let's take a look. Leviticus 23:3. Says 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, a holy what? Convocation, it says. It says, ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. What is a convocation? It's a gathering. It's a convening of God's people, right? If it's a holy convocation, it's for that. Even educational facility, or education, like universities have convocations. Right? It's a convening for a particular purpose, right? But for Christians, we're convening for a reason, right? Forsake not the assembly, right? Together. We're not to forsake the assembly. God wants us to assemble, and when laws are made that you're not allowed to assemble, there's a problem. It's a conflict now between you and God, or them and God, sorry, right? That's where the conflict lies. So that is the reason why they stayed put. Right? They were in God's church. They were in his house. And then God told them to assemble. It wasn't man. It wasn't their own ideas. It wasn't tradition. They were assembling because God told them to assemble. Right? And we're to edify. How can you edify if you're scattered all over the place? Right? So this will be a major issue I see in the future. If it's progression, kind of like Ellen White was saying, it might be just Sunday laws. And then it becomes Sabbath laws. What happens on the Sabbath, right? And then that is directly between now, an affront against God at that particular point. Because the Sabbath is clear, and God's told us how to assemble and how to worship on the Sabbath day. So I think that's important also. There's so much, I guess, we could look at in regard to this, but I do think we need to study, we need to know before the crisis hits. Sure, in the crisis, it will get us studying too. I understand that. But it's good to know before how we will respond if it comes, right? Also. But so there's not a division, there's not a schism within the church in regard to that. Well, God bless. There's just some thoughts. I thought you'd like to have the story anyway. The story was great, for sure. But let's close this short study with hymn number 532, Day by Day. 532.